Got it? Okay. All right, so we've basically finished our molecular metabolism part of the course. And you'll be testing on that, of course, Wednesday. The test will be the same format as the prior test. There'll be some true-false and mostly multiple choice. And it'll be Scantron in format. Again, for those of you viewing at home, you will simply answer your questions directly on the exam before you send it back to me. So what I want to do now is start the genetics portion, and we'll do genetics for the rest of the term. It's actually kind of good. I'm about a day ahead, so I'll be able to take an extra day on genetics. We usually don't get as far as I'd like to in genetics. So the next session after this one, we'll go ahead and do a review for the exam. So I'll bring in a practice exam. We'll go through that, and then we'll take the exam. But today, what I want to do is sort of go through an early history of genetics. And the reason I do this is because, first of all, genetics lends itself really well to a historical approach. The discoveries that were made in genetics follow a historical timeline, and so it's really easy to talk about the major concepts as they occurred historically. You will not need to take notes on the stuff I do today, so just sit back and relax and watch and listen. One of the important things about this, however, is to sort of impress upon you that a historical approach is, looking at the history of a science is almost as important as looking at the concepts of a particular science, because where it's been historically sort of describes where we're going with it in the future. All right, well, I'm going to start this genetics history at the very beginning and ask the question, what did the most primitive humans think about the world? How did they view the world? How did they figure out what was alive and what wasn't? To a primitive mind, you can sort of think, well, obviously they didn't know a lot of the stuff we know now. They might have looked at living things and said, okay, if they move, then they're alive. I mean, we see things move, so we know that they're alive like us, therefore they must be alive. And that includes things like trees, right? They blow in the wind, they move. Animals, of course, moved. And even rocks could move. Okay? I mean, after all, rocks roll down a hill, they're moving, so maybe they're alive. Okay? The other thing that primitive humans probably notice is that things tended to reproduce themselves. I mean, you can't go through life without noticing that sort of thing. However, you may not necessarily know why it's happening. The connection between sex and reproduction is something that had taken literally thousands of years to figure out. All right, so our ancestors noticed an obvious fact. Some things tended to reproduce themselves. Of course, people did it. Okay. I can't tell if that baby looks more like the mother or the father. Hard. Other animals did it. Okay, so maybe this is another hallmark of living organisms. Well, what about rocks? Okay, they move, but do they reproduce? Well, perhaps so. I mean, to the primitive mind, it may have seemed that rocks could give birth to little pebbles with a little prodding. Okay, you got to bust them up first. All right, so things tend to reproduce themselves. Well, the whole idea of genetics is going to be, how do things reproduce themselves? How is it that you get offspring that look like the parents? Or maybe the more important question is, how is it that sometimes you get offspring that don't look like the parents? And if you dismiss the mailman or the milkman effect, then what you've got left is to ask the question, why did this happen? Right? I noticed it was mostly the older students that laughed at that joke. Yeah. Think about it. You'll figure out the mailman effect. The primitive mind probably did not see the connection between sex and reproduction. In fact, there are still some primitive societies that believe that there is a lot of mysticism involved. It's not the sexual act itself that causes reproduction or leads to reproduction. It is, in fact, the phases of the moon or how vigilantly you prayed before the sex act or whatever. So there are still societies that believe that. So that's something that connection is something that was probably not made initially. Here's an early scientist trying to figure out how rocks reproduce. Well, maybe he's got the wrong genders there. Okay, maybe they're both males or both females. Okay. So they certainly couldn't reproduce in the traditional sense. As is typical for humans, the females tend to get things faster than the males do. Okay, maybe because they have to carry those damn things for 9 months. Right? I've been told that guys can't know what that's like unless they try to pass a watermelon through their anus or something. But those of you who have had children can probably relate to that. This guy, however, I don't know, maybe you should try some, candlelight, some romantic music. Never works. Expensive jewelry, that usually does the trick. Okay. So we go from hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists. The advent of agriculture dramatically changed the way humans were doing things. Humans stuck around in one place for a longer period of time, and we see that in the archaeological record. Well, one of the things that they did was they started domesticating plants and animals. The dog has been with us for probably at least 40,000 years. Cats have been with us for at least 9,000 years. That's actually one reason why we can catch more diseases from dogs than cats, because those pathogens have been associated with us longer, and so they've adapted to being able to infect us. Well, one of the things that happens as a result of animal breeding is you take a wild species and you turn it into something that's docile, that you can herd, that you can control, and that you can utilize. Okay? We call this practical genetics. Animal and plant breeding is really practical genetics, the application of genetics to practical concerns. At the same time that people were domesticating animals, of course, they were domesticating plants. A lot of our crop plants have been bred for thousands of years, probably not domesticating them like this. Unfortunately, all right, but there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, this is the way these societies were. But there was always mysticism involved. Okay? It was always a situation of, well, our crop will fail unless the priests do the pollinating, or unless the priests pray over the crops, or whatever. Okay? Ancient societies certainly did that, but even into medieval and contemporary societies, we still have that idea that you've got to have some sort of mystical involvement to get things to work right. So, for example, here's a picture of Assyrian priests from around 800 BC pollinating a date palm. They were the ones that did it. The average person wasn't thought to be able to do this because you had to have godly involvement. The Egyptians were certainly the same way. I mean, the gods figured into almost everything they did. Good grief, they were strict resurrectionists. Their whole life was based on what they were going to do with their bodies when they died. It was pretty amazing. All right. There were a number of ancient societies that noticed some interesting things about genetics. Ancient Hindu societies actually recognized that some diseases tended to run in families. Okay, so they had recognized and identified genetic syndromes. The interesting thing about it was, again, this mystical involvement. They thought it was a punishment from the gods. Right? The gods had punished these families, and therefore they were producing offspring that had problems. We can move on then to the Greeks. This is a sort of cartoonish representation of Socrates. Socrates was an interesting fellow. One of the things that he noticed or asked questions about was, why do offspring tend to resemble their parents? And he's probably one of the major people that at least wrote down the question, why do offspring sometimes not resemble their parents? What he was referring to specifically was, why is it that Athenian statesmen who are diligent and hardworking, why do they produce offspring that are lazy slobs? Well, so he asked the question he probably shouldn't have. He provoked the Athenians to put him to death. Not for this, I mean for a lot of things. He had to drink hemlock. I'm told that drinking hemlock is a horrible, horrible way to die. Very painful. All right, so much for Socrates. Aristotle. Now this is really important. This concept that Aristotle had is going to pervade reproductive biology and an understanding of genetics for the next 1,000 years, basically. It's going to pervade scientific thought all the way up into the early 1800s, if you can believe it. I mean, it's just astounding that this idea held for so long. I like this term, the peripatetic. I tend to do that, and I apologize, but I do tend to pace from side to side because I want to get everybody covered. But I had a biochem instructor that used to do that, just constantly pace back and forth, back and forth. It was like watching a tennis match. It was awful. All right, so here's the idea. All inheritance comes from the father. Well, it's a male-oriented society. What do you expect? Right? The male semen determines the baby's form. The mother is just a vessel. She provides all the nutrients, but she doesn't provide any of the genetic component, any components that produce the form of the offspring. Those aren't provided by the female. Well, there's a very important question here. Where do girls come from? If males are producing or providing all of the components that produce the form of the offspring, then how do you get girls? Because they should all be boys. Aristotle had a quick answer for that. He said that sometimes the female contaminates the offspring such that they actually produce girls instead of boys. Okay. This idea is going to come back to haunt us in a philosophy that came about in the late 1500s, early 1600s. It was a group of individuals called spermists who resurrected this idea of Aristotle and believed that all of the components for making the baby came from the male. All right, well, the Romans came along and conquered most of the Mediterranean. They didn't think much of philosophy, although they did have their share. They made contributions in other things, in tactics, in architecture, in government. They borrowed a lot, too. Don't know if you've ever noticed, but the whole Roman pantheon of gods is just borrowed from the Greeks. They just changed the names. One interesting idea that they added, genetic idea, was that mares could be fertilized by the wind. Okay. That mares could be fertilized by the wind. Right. So this horse is stymied as to why it hasn't gotten pregnant yet. Maybe you have to lift up the tail. All right, so the Roman Empire falls. Yeah, I know, we just went through, 400 years of history in 30 seconds. It's okay. The Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages, whatever you want to call it, most people sort of think from the fall of the Roman Empire until about 1000 AD is Dark Ages, and then the rest is Middle Ages. Not a time in which science was very important. A lot of ecclesiastical control of society. I mean, you had the feudal system. You had people who were basically barely struggling to barely get by. They didn't have anything to look forward to except maybe an afterlife. I mean, it's no surprise that the church gained great power in this period. Scientific thought was sort of lost, and any kind of descriptions of genetic events were reduced to things like descriptions of monstrous births: two-headed kids, two-headed cows, two-headed cats, cats with multiple toes. All of those kinds of strange things. And of course, they were attributed to some sort of divine influence, typically a malevolent divine influence. You've got this whole good and evil, God and devil thing going on. There are descriptions of really bizarre events like half a cow descending from the clouds in a thunderclap. Right. All kinds of funny stuff going on in the Middle Ages. One of the ideas that came about in the Middle Ages, and it actually originated with the Greeks, but it was the idea of spontaneous generation. Okay, the concept that formerly living or non-living matter could give rise to living organisms, like mud could give rise to frogs. Right? So the idea that living organisms could arise spontaneously from non-living matter. Right, so, for example, maggots coming from decaying meat, horsehair turning into worms, this sort of thing. If you think about what medieval society was like, it's not difficult to understand this. There was no sanitation. Right? You just took the chamber pot and dumped it out the window onto the street if you lived in an urban area. I mean, the streets were just full of refuse. So, it's no surprise that these ideas sort of came about. Plus, people didn't really take baths. In fact, one of the reasons that the bubonic plague swept through Europe so badly was because people hadn't figured out until towards the end that if they practiced personal hygiene, they had less risk of getting bit by these fleas. Okay? So, you live in a world where slime is common. You sort of see this kind of thing happening every day. It's important to realize why this counters any kind of genetic thought. If you have spontaneous generation, you have slime giving rise to living organisms, then it doesn't really make sense to talk about parent and offspring resemblance. All right? So any kind of genetic ideas are just not going to be possible here. Okay? Not much family resemblance between slime and frogs. So the first thing we got to do is get rid of this idea of spontaneous generation. And there was actually a very simple experiment that was done that was completed in the 17th century and is performed by the Italian Francesco Redi. This is a beautiful, elegant, simple experiment. Great example of the scientific method. He's got a control group and an experimental group. He takes pieces of fresh meat, puts them in jars. One of the jars he covers, one of the others he leaves open to the open air. All right? He observes flies coming and resting on the open jar. After some time passes, you find maggots only in the open jar, where the flies had been. So then those maggots pupate, that is, they produce cocoons, and they emerge as fully formed flies. The whole idea here is that in the control group, the jar that was covered, yeah, it stinks to high heaven, but you didn't get any flies spontaneously generating from it. Right? Which demonstrates that spontaneous generation is false. Okay? Instead, right, maggots come from flies, flies come from maggots. You do not get spontaneous generation from that rotting meat. You see the flies coming from it because the previous generation had come there and laid eggs. All right, so Francesco Redi conclusively demonstrates that spontaneous generation is incorrect. So, of course, the idea hangs on for another 300 years. All right, another idea. Remember, I said it's going to be important to remember what Aristotle came up with, the idea that all of the genetic component, if we can call it that, comes from the male. Well, that is going to be resurrected by this group of people in the 1600s that called themselves spermists. When the microscope was invented, okay, we got to the point where we could grind lenses to the carefulness that was required for microscope use. We finally got microscopes. We can see stuff that you can't see with the naked eye. Okay, somebody gets the bright idea of looking at sperm, and they see these little wriggling things in there. And by golly, they say that they see a little preformed human inside that sperm. They called it a homunculus. Right? Leeuwenhoek, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who was like the great microscopist of the period, said he saw these. And of course, everybody else said, well, if Leeuwenhoek saw them, then it can't be wrong, even though maybe I don't see them. Well, there's a problem with this. If this preformed organism is a boy, it has tiny testicles that have tiny sperm that have preformed organisms that have tiny testicles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. The other problem is, it just ain't there. Right? Why this idea stuck around for so long is hard to imagine, except that, once again, if you look at the history of the period, the social climate, you're looking at a male-oriented society, a male-dominated society. So it seems natural for them to extend that to the biological world and say males are the most important in a biological sense as well as in a social sense. Perhaps that's the reason why these ideas persisted for so long. There was, however, an opposing camp. And they were called ovists. All right? They took the other approach. They said, wait a minute. You see an egg, a chicken lay an egg, and the egg hatches into a chick. So the egg has got to be important. And that comes from the female. Okay, so this guy, William Harvey, who lived or did most of his work during the reign of Charles I, just before the Kingslayers killed Charles I and took the regency in England. All right, he coined this phrase, ex ovo omnia, out of egg, all. All right, so he's in the other camp. He's saying the egg is really, really important. Every animal must have eggs. So he starts looking for mammal eggs. All right, well, you know what kind of difficulty this is going to be. He persuades Charles I to let him hunt in the Royal Deer Park, kill male deer, and dissect them to try and, or kill female deer, and try to dissect them to find eggs. All right, dozens of deer later, he has to admit his failure. He never did find a mammalian egg. Okay. So 200 years go by, and people still are looking for mammalian eggs, still carrying this idea that, okay, there's got to be a female component to reproduction. There's got to be there. Well, obviously, we know now why it's difficult to see mammalian eggs. They're microscopic, and they're fairly rare. Okay? Males produce millions of sperm on a daily basis, whereas females only produce a very few eggs. All right? There apparently is actually a reason for that. Males that do sexual reproduction are actually trying to maximize their reproductive opportunities. And so they make very small packets of DNA, basically, and they make lots of them so they can get lots of mating opportunities. Whereas females, on the other hand, because they have to expend so much energy for that offspring, are maximizing their ability to make sure those offspring are cared for in a biological sense. So that's why they don't produce a lot of eggs. All right. Okay, so eventually the first mammal egg was discovered in a dog, of all things, and people finally were vindicated and said, okay, now we know that these things have eggs, and we know that animals are sexually reproducing critters just like other critters are. In fact, the question of plant sex had been decided a long time before this. This guy, Camerarius, there's his date, 1665 to 1721. He was the one who sort of figured out how sexual reproduction works in plants. He said that flowers have sex organs very much like those of animals. You have a male component and a female component, which are both contributing to the formation of the offspring. Okay, so the male part, the anther, contains pollen, which is analogous to sperm. And actually, pollen grains are usually 2 nuclei. And sperm, of course, are only 1. So it's a little different, but it's analogous. And then the female part is the stigma. The ovary contains the eggs. Part of the pollen is actually penetrating the ovary, and it causes the seeds to develop. You get fertilization. And then many plants have flowers that have both male and female components. And in fact, many plants can self-fertilize. Okay? Some others cannot. All right, so by the early 1800s, plants and animals were known to be sexual. Males are contributing sperm, females are contributing eggs. It was thought that that was an equal contribution from both parents. 1800s, I mean, think about this. It was way back in the 1600s that Francesco Redi showed that spontaneous generation didn't work. We had these 2 opposing camps, the spermus and ovus, and these antiquated ideas had stuck around for such a long time. Why did it take so long? Why did it take until the early 1800s to figure this out? I mean, we're smack in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. Good grief. Mechanistic thought is well developed, so why did it take so long? In fact, it took even longer to figure out how genetics works. Darwin had no clue about how genetics worked, and he proposed this idea of what he called pangenesis, where you get this blending of characteristics from the male and the female parent in the offspring. So he had this idea of blending inheritance. It turns out he was dead wrong about that. All right, we need to go back to the practical geneticists, the ones that are out in the field doing all of the work that is necessary to breed plant and animal species. The reason we have to go back to them is because it is from them that we are going to get a concept of how genetics works. All right? We're going to find that genetics is not a blending, but more of a particulate sort of thing. Okay? So they're going to lead more or less directly to the discovery of the gene. And here's what we knew already. There are stable varieties that breed true. Okay, the offspring have the same characteristics as the parents. That's what's meant by true breeding. The offspring will always have the same characteristics as the parents. There's some examples up there. Labrador retrievers, people with blue eyes, although it's not exactly true. Macintosh apples. Right? So you've got certain characteristics that you always see in these particular varieties. Some other strains show a lot of variation. Okay? People with brown eyes can have blue-eyed children, for example. So there is variation in these populations. Okay, the trick is that you can produce hybrids. Right? It is possible to make parents from 2 different varieties to produce hybrids. Nectarines, right? Cross between a peach and a plum. Mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey. Obviously, not all hybrids at the time were possible. Pigs with trees, humans with strawberries. Okay. Now these hybrids are, in a sense, possible, right? Because we can genetically engineer. We could stick pig genes into a plant or plant genes into a pig. We could take strawberry genes and stick them into humans if it was ethical to do so, which it's not. We could take human genes and stick them in strawberries if we wanted to. Right? Genetic engineering has completely changed the way we think about the natural world, which is kind of good and kind of bad. Okay. From true breeding strains, occasionally you would see an unusual individual that did not have the same traits as the parents. In Darwin's time, in Victorian England, these were called sports. They often occurred in, for example, pigeon breeding. Darwin was a pigeon breeder. A lot of Victorian gentlemen were pigeon breeders. It was sort of the favored pastime of the period. And so they noticed these very unusual individuals turning up in what were otherwise true breeding strains. And by crossing those individuals back to the normal types, these farmers created a lot of interesting stable varieties. Stubby-legged sheep, which were great when all you had to build fences was a bunch of rocks. Go to Scotland or Ireland and look at all the rock fences and you'll see those sorts of things. Hornless cattle, which are a little bit safer to be around, I suppose. New types of wheat, peas, strawberries, almost any grain crop that you want to think of. Some new varieties have been developed by using these sports, as they call them. Nowadays we call those mutations. That's what they are. Still a matter of trial and error, though. Okay? So people started to wonder, maybe there's a more controlled way of selecting for these traits. All right. Can we ensure that we could always get strains that have these particular characteristics, so we're not just guessing on how this is going to work out? What people are asking for basically is some rules of genetics to follow so that they don't have to play a guessing game so much. They want some rules of inheritance. A lot of people tried. A lot of people tried. Nobody succeeded. For a number of reasons. Some people crossed breeds that differed in too many characteristics. The trick, if you're going to find rules, basic laws of inheritance, why look at 20 traits? One will do. Okay? Look at a single trait in a particular organism. Find out what's going on with that trait. Then extend it to 2 traits and ask what happens when you have both of those traits together. Then maybe extend it to 3 or 4 and ask the same questions. What happens with those traits when you have them all interacting, if in fact they interact? Right? So too many differences and you can't keep track of them all. Another thing they didn't do is they failed to keep a careful count. As we'll see, genetics is really nothing more than a statistical game, a numbers game. The more offspring you've got, the better your conclusions can be. If you have 10 offspring, okay, fine. But if you got 100, you're closer to the real situation. If you got 1,000 or 10,000, it's even better. So that raises a third point. You've got to use an organism that reproduces lots and quickly. Right? Something that produces lots of offspring and does it very rapidly, so that the turnover time is not so great. But you don't want to be waiting for a year or 2 or 10 for your results. All right, so the problem seemed hopeless and scientists gave up. A lot of people said, to hell with it. We're not going to try to figure out these rules of inheritance. We're going to go on to other things that we can get accolades for that are a little bit easier to study. The laws of inheritance were finally figured out and ignored until the turn of the century, until 1900. I mean, it's amazing. Just think of where we'd be now if those rules of inheritance had been understood and publicized when they were actually discovered in the 1860s. Okay, we'd be 40 years ahead of where we are now. Maybe we'd be engineering our own embryos by now. Who knows? All right, well, so it was ignored for 30 years, and the headline in the papers might have read something like this: "Monk finds gene, the world yawns." It was, in fact, a monk that did it. Gregor Mendel. Mendel's a really interesting character. If you ever have a chance to read about the life of Gregor Mendel, he had a lot of adversity to face. He was depressed for much of his life. He had these bouts of depression where he actually laid in bed for up to a year at a time and only got up, presumably, to go to the bathroom and eat. Sometimes he didn't even eat. He had trouble in school, partly because of the language. He was from Austria, or from Czechoslovakia, but he was going to school in Austria, and so there was a language barrier there that he had to face. And he ended up in a situation where his family was poor and he was penniless, but he had an education. And so what he ended up doing was doing the only thing that, or the only option that was available for educated but destitute men in that society. He joined the church, went to a monastery, he became a monk. Okay? But becoming a monk was probably the best thing to happen in terms of scientific progress, because it was there that he had enough time on his hands to be able to do the experiments he needed to do. All right, so 50 years of research. You fail to find any laws of inheritance. It's going to require a lot of patience, a lot of time, and a lot of luck. And so I guess if we allow ourselves a little bit of mysticism, we could say no wonder it happened in the monastery. All right, so here's the guy, Gregor Mendel. In his spare time, he bred pea plants. Why did he use peas? Probably because they were available. He had them. But the other reason he used peas was because the particular peas that they had differed in a number of different characteristics. And so he would be able to cross plants that differed in these characteristics and ask the question, how are these characteristics inherited? Do the offspring resemble the parents? Do the offspring of those offspring resemble the parents? How many generations do you go out before you lose those characteristics, if you lose them? Under a blending system, you'd tend to water out all of those differences, because you'd get a blending in every generation. There'd be a little bit less intensity of that trait, and it'd get blended out. But under a particulate system, where you've got little whatever particles maybe that are determining inheritance, then those particles aren't going to be changed as they pass from one generation to the next. So that was a question that Gregor Mendel was trying to answer. This is really where we start up in our discussion of modern classical genetics, because it was the rules that were established by Gregor Mendel that sort of guided genetics for the next 30 or 40 years, when they were rediscovered at the turn of the century. So probably until the 1940s, when the molecular revolution began. It was all classical genetics, and we were asking the questions, how do Mendel's rules apply to other organisms? How do they sometimes not apply? Right? Why do Mendel's rules not apply in certain cases? All those sorts of situations. That's all classical or transmission genetics, and that's what we'll consider this term. And then next term we'll start looking at molecular genetics, and we'll look at some of the really hot stuff like gene cloning and embryo cloning and that sort of thing. All right, so Monday or next session we'll review for the exam, take the exam Wednesday, and then Friday we'll start our formal look at classical genetics.